Welcome to this exploration of one of the most disturbing cases ever documented in American history. Before we start, I'd like to ask you to share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're curious to know how far these recorded accounts travel and at what hours of the day or night they reach their audience. In the fall of 1837, the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans was filled with the city's wealthiest men. The auction that evening had drawn an unusual amount of attention, even for a town known as the largest slave market in the United States. What set this particular sale apart was not the number of people on the block, but the presence of a single woman who would soon become known across the city as the Pearl. A name that would reverberate through the French Quarter's cobblestone streets for decades. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, with skin described in the auction papers as the color of fresh cream, touched by the faintest hint of coffee. Her deep amber eyes seemed to shift hue depending on the light, and her long, glossy black hair fell in waves down her back. The auctioneer, Thomas Williams, introduced her simply as lot number 17. But those present knew they were witnessing something remarkable. As murmurs moved through the crowd like ripples on the Mississippi, bidding began at an astonishing sum, 5 times the price of an ordinary house servant. What followed would become one of the strangest chapters in New Orleans history, a city already notorious for its complex racial hierarchy and the brutal economics of human bondage. It would connect powerful families, uncover long-buried secrets, and eventually lead to a series of disappearances that remained unsolved until 1962, when a renovation project at the old Delacroix mansion on Royal Street revealed a hidden room containing a leather-bound journal, 3 human finger bones, and a portrait of a woman whose beauty, even captured in aging paint, seemed almost otherworldly. This is the story of Elellanena Reynolds, known to most as the Pearl, and the terrifying truth behind her disappearance in the winter of 1842. The auction that night in 1837 was recorded by multiple witnesses, including James Thornton, a northern businessman in New Orleans to establish cotton trade connections. In his personal diary, recovered from his Boston estate in 1952, Thornton described the scene with clear discomfort. He had never witnessed such frenzy among gentlemen of standing as occurred that night at the Hotel Exchange. The woman for sale was indeed striking in appearance, yet the behavior of those present seemed driven by something beyond mere desire for human property. There was an almost religious fervor in their bidding, as if acquiring this particular slave held significance beyond the material world. What Thornton couldn't have known was the complex web of history surrounding the woman on the block. Elellanena Reynolds had not been born into slavery, nor had she arrived through the usual channels of the domestic slave trade. According to ship records from the port of New Orleans, she had come just 3 weeks earlier on a vessel called the Augusta, listed not as cargo but as a passenger accompanying a merchant named Marcus Bennett. But by the time the Augusta docked, Bennett was dead, supposedly from a fever contracted in Havana during their voyage. With no free papers found among Bennett's possessions, Eleanor was seized by port authorities and eventually placed for auction. This much was public record. What wasn't known until the discovery of the Delacroix journal was why a woman of such obvious refinement and education had ended up in these circumstances, and why certain families in New Orleans had taken such extraordinary interest in ensuring she would never leave the city. Before we go deeper into the events of that winter, we must understand the New Orleans of 1837. The city was then a complex mosaic of cultures, economies, and racial classifications, more elaborate than anywhere else in America. Following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, The city had transformed from a French and Spanish colonial outpost into a booming American port where fortunes were made in cotton, sugar, and human beings. New Orleans had developed a three-tiered racial system unlike the strict black-white division found elsewhere in the South. Between these categories existed the gens de couleur libres, free people of color, many of whom were wealthy property owners and sometimes slaveholders themselves. It was a city of contradictions. Brutal slave markets operated within walking distance of opera houses. Codes noirs regulated the treatment of slaves, while sophisticated social events called quadroon balls facilitated arrangements between white men and free women of color. Above all, it was a place where appearance and bloodlines carried immense social and legal weight. The difference between freedom and bondage could hinge on a single ancestor, a fact that would prove central to Elellanena Reynolds' story. The winning bid that night came from Charles Delacroix, a wealthy sugar planter whose family had been in Louisiana since the early French colonial period. Delacroix paid the unprecedented sum of $70,000, enough to purchase an entire plantation of field workers, for a woman who, by all accounts, had no experience with domestic service or field labor. The transaction was recorded by notary William Patterson, whose ledger noted something unusual. Delacroix insisted the bill of sale describe Elellanena not as a slave, but as a ward to be housed in his Royal Street residence. What happened after Elellanena was taken to the Delacroix home remains unclear due to conflicting accounts. Household staff interviewed decades later by a journalist from the Daily Picayune recalled that she was treated not as a servant, but as a guest, given a private room in the family quarters, and provided with clothing befitting a society woman. Yet she was never seen leaving the property, and visitors to the house reported that Delacroix introduced her as his distant cousin from France, who spoke little English. According to household records, Delacroix's wife, Isabelle, left for her family home in Natchez just 2 weeks after Elellenena's arrival, taking their 3 children with her. She would not return for nearly 6 months. During this period, Charles Delacroix closed his Royal Street house to all visitors and conducted his business entirely through written correspondence delivered by his private secretary. The mystery deepened when in January 1838, Dr. Samuel Lawrence was summoned to the Delacroix home to attend to Elellanena, who was reportedly suffering from a persistent cough. Dr. Lawrence's medical journal, preserved in the archives of Tulane University, contained an entry noting that he was called to attend to a young woman at the Delacroix residence. The patient exhibited symptoms consistent with consumption, though her overall constitution appeared sound. What troubled him more was the evident distress in her manner. When alone, she asked if he knew of her true circumstances before her arrival in New Orleans. Before he could respond, Delacroix returned to the room, and she spoke no further on the matter. Dr. Lawrence noted that he prescribed standard bed rest and tonics, but also recorded his impression that the lady's ailment seemed as much of the spirit as of the body. He was never called back to the house. By spring of that year, rumors had begun circulating through New Orleans society about the mysterious beauty of the Delacroix mansion. Some claimed she was Charles Delacroix's illegitimate daughter, others that she was his mistress brought from abroad. The most persistent rumor, however, was that she was somehow connected to the Villers family, one of the oldest and most secretive lineages in Louisiana, whose patriarch, Henry Villers, had been among the most aggressive bidders at the auction before Delacroix's winning offer. The Villers family had built their fortune in the colony's early days, controlling vast sugar plantations and, according to local legend, engaging in privateering during the War of 1812. By 1837, they had largely withdrawn from public life, maintaining their estate on the outskirts of the city and rarely attending society events. What connected them to a young woman newly arrived from Havana? That question would remain unanswered for more than a century. The Delacqua Journal, discovered during renovations in 1962, provided the first real insight into Elellanena life in the mansion. Written in a precise, educated hand, the journal began in February 1838. The early entries were mundane, recording weather conditions and brief notes about books read or meals taken. But as winter gave way to spring, the entries grew more revealing. On March 11, 1838, she wrote that he had agreed to allow her access to the family library, though she was still forbidden from venturing beyond the inner courtyard. When she asked why she must remain hidden away, he said only that it was for her protection. From what, he would not say. She began to fear that the story he told her about her papers being processed was merely a fiction to keep her compliant. Later, on April 23, 1838, she noted that C had brought a visitor, an elderly man named Villers, who stared at her with such intensity that she felt as though he was searching for something in her features. They spoke in French, believing she could not understand, about resemblance and bloodline. When she later asked C about this conversation, he became agitated and reminded her of her precarious position without free papers. She remained legally his property, regardless of her true history. The journal entries became increasingly distressed as Elellanena apparently began to realize that Delacqua had no intention of securing her freedom as he had initially promised. By summer, she was planning an escape. On July 17, 1838, she wrote that she had managed to contact a housemaid who agreed to deliver a message to the offices of the American consul. If her mother's story was true, her birth in Philadelphia should be sufficient to establish her free status regardless of her appearance. She needed to act quickly before C made good on his threat to send her to his plantation if she continued to cause difficulties. The next entry, dated August 2nd, contained a single line: "It was a trap." The maid had informed C of her plan. She was to be moved the next day. The journal then fell silent for nearly a month. When entries resumed in September, Elellanena was writing from Boys Refuge, the Delacqua sugar plantation 50 miles downriver from New Orleans. Her situation had clearly deteriorated. On September 5, 1838, she wrote that she was kept in the former overseer's house, separate from both the main residence and the slave quarters. A woman named Martha had been assigned to attend to her needs, though she suspected Martha's primary role was to report her activities to the plantation manager. She had seen C only once since her arrival, when he came to inform her that any further attempts to contact outside authorities would result in her being reclassified as a field worker. The meaning was clear enough. It was at Boys Refuge that Elellanena story intersected with another mysterious figure, Joseph Miller, a northern abolitionist who had infiltrated Louisiana society, posing as a doctor interested in treating slave ailments. Miller's coded correspondence with anti-slavery activists in Boston, decoded and published in 1949, made reference to a woman of unusual circumstance held at the Delacqua plantation, who claimed to have been born free in Philadelphia to a mother who was herself a free woman. Miller apparently managed to speak with Eleanor briefly during a visit to Boys Refuge in October 1838. He wrote that the subject had reason to believe her imprisonment was connected not to ordinary human trafficking, but to some matter of inheritance and identity that threatened powerful interests in the region. She begged assistance in contacting authorities in Philadelphia who might have records of her birth and parentage. Miller promised to investigate her claims, But his work in Louisiana came to an abrupt end in November 1838, when his true purpose was discovered. He narrowly escaped the state with his life. There is no record that he ever managed to pursue Elellanena case further. Elellanena journal entries from Boys' Refuge grew increasingly infrequent through the winter of 1838 into 1839. She recorded her observations of plantation life, her failed attempts to convince household servants to aid her, and her growing suspicion that her confinement had some purpose beyond mere ownership. On December 12, 1838, she wrote that she had overheard the plantation manager speaking with a visitor about the Villers' inheritance and the problem of verification. When they realized she was within earshot, they fell silent and separated. Later, she asked Martha if she knew anything about the Villers family. Martha grew pale and refused to speak on the subject, saying only that they were not people to be trifled with. What connection could she possibly have to them? The mystery deepened in February 1839 when, according to the journal, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. Henry Villers himself, now quite elderly, came to Boys' Refuge without Delacroix's knowledge or permission. On February 26, 1839, she wrote that the old man came alone, dismissing Martha from the house. He asked about her mother, specifically whether she had possessed a gold locket with an engraving of a ship. When she confirmed that her mother had worn such a piece until her death, he nodded as though something had been confirmed. He then asked if she knew the circumstances of her father's death. She told him what her mother had always said, that he was a French merchant who died at sea before her birth. At this, the old man made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. He said that her mother was a prudent woman, but perhaps too prudent for her own good. He left without explaining further, promising to return, though she was not certain whether to hope for or dread such a visit. Henry Villers never did return to Boys' Refuge. 3 days after his visit to Eleanor, he was found dead in his study, apparently from natural causes related to his advanced age. His death, however, set in motion a complex legal battle over the substantial Villers estate, as Henry had died without a male heir. His nearest relative was a nephew named Louis Villers, who immediately filed to claim the inheritance. It was during this inheritance dispute that the connection between Eleanor and the Villers family began to emerge, at least in the pages of her increasingly fragmented journal. In April 1839, she wrote that she arrived in a state of great agitation, demanding to know exactly what the old man had said to her. When she related their brief conversation, he became even more disturbed. He asked repeatedly whether the old man had mentioned any documents or papers he might have given her mother. She told him truthfully that the old man had mentioned nothing of the sort. C then searched her room thoroughly before leaving, taking with him her mother's Bible, the only possession she had managed to keep from Philadelphia. Within its pages were her mother's few letters and papers, including her certificate of birth. She feared she had now lost the only proof of who she truly was. The journal's final entries suggest that Elellanena had begun to piece together the truth of her situation. In an entry dated June 17, 1839, she wrote that she now understood why she was brought there. It was never about her value as property, but about preventing her from claiming what might rightfully be hers. Her mother once told her that her father's family had rejected her, but she never explained why. If what she now suspected was true, then her father was not simply a French merchant but a Villers, perhaps even Henry's son. And if documentation of such a connection existed, it would explain C's desperate efforts to keep her hidden away and classified as a slave rather than a potential claimant to one of the largest fortunes in Louisiana. This theory aligned with rumors long circulating in New Orleans about Henry Villers's estranged son, John Baptist, who had allegedly formed a relationship with a free woman of color in Philadelphia in the early 1800s. According to these rumors, Jean Baptist had been disowned by his father, but may have secretly married the woman before his death at sea in 1817, the year of Eleanor's birth. If Elellanena was indeed Jean Baptiste's legitimate daughter, and if proof of the marriage existed, she would have had a claim to the Villers' inheritance under French inheritance laws that still influenced Louisiana's unique legal code. Such a claim would have been unprecedented and scandalous, as it would meant recognizing a woman with African ancestry, however minimal, as the rightful heir to one of Louisiana's most prestigious white family fortunes. The final dated entry in Elellanena journal was from September 3, 1839. She wrote that she had found a way. The riverboat stopped there the next day to take on sugar. Martha had agreed to help her in exchange for the pearl earrings her mother left her. If all went well, she would be in New Orleans by nightfall, and from there she could seek passage north. She had to find those papers before it was too late. The journal ends there, leaving historians to piece together what happened next through other sources. According to Boys Refuge plantation records, a female slave matching Elellanena description was indeed reported missing on September 4, 1839. A substantial reward was offered for her return, but the primary search focused on riverboats heading north toward free territories. Instead, evidence suggests that Elellanena made her way back to New Orleans, perhaps intending to search the Delacroix townhouse for her mother's papers before leaving the South. A receipt from a French quarter apothecary, dated September 7, 1839, shows the purchase of women's toiletries, charged to the account of Marie Laveau, the famous voodoo priestess who was known to sometimes shelter fugitives within her extensive network. For almost 3 years, Elellanena Reynolds seemingly vanished from all records. The Villers' inheritance case proceeded, with Louis Villers ultimately being confirmed as the rightful heir in 1841, after no other claimants came forward with sufficient proof of relation. Charles Delacroix, after an initial aggressive search for his missing property, appeared to abandon the pursuit, focusing instead on resolving mounting financial difficulties that had begun to plague his once prosperous sugar operations. Then, in January 1842, Elellanena Reynolds reappeared in New Orleans society in a manner that shocked even that scandal-accustomed city. She attended the annual Mardi Gras ball at the St. Louis Hotel, the very building where she had been sold 5 years earlier, not as a slave or servant, but as the elegantly attired companion of Louis Villers, the new head of the Villers family. Multiple witnesses described the sensation caused by her entrance. The society columnist for the Daily Picayune wrote that the mysterious beauty on the arm of Mr. Villers caused all conversation to cease momentarily as they entered the ballroom. She was adorned in a gown of midnight blue silk that emphasized her extraordinary complexion and bearing. Those who had attended certain transactions at the same venue some years prior exchanged significant glances, though none dared make explicit reference to the lady's previous appearance there. What arrangement existed between Eleanor and Louis Villers remains uncertain. Some historians suggest he may have purchased her freedom secretly, while others propose a more complex scenario in which Elellanena had obtained leverage over the Villers' heir through discovery of documents related to her parentage. What is clear is that their public appearance together represented an unprecedented breach of New Orleans' social boundaries, regardless of Elellanena ambiguous racial classification. Charles Delacroix was also in attendance at the ball that night, According to multiple accounts, he grew visibly distressed upon seeing Elellanena with Louis Villers, attempting to approach them before being physically restrained by friends. He left the event shortly thereafter. 3 days later, he filed a legal complaint claiming that Louis Villers had unlawfully taken possession of human property rightfully belonging to the Delacroix estate. The complaint was quietly withdrawn within 24 hours. On February 12, 1842, Eleanor and Louis Villers were seen boarding a steamship bound for France. According to passenger manifests, they traveled as Mr. Louis Villers and Ward. They left behind a New Orleans already ablaze with rumor and speculation. They would never return to American soil. And here the documented history might have ended were it not for the events that unfolded at the Delacroix mansion 2 weeks after their departure. On February 27, 1842, neighbors reported unusual activity at the normally quiet Delacroix residence on Royal Street. Lights burned through the night, and servants were seen carrying large trunks to waiting carriages. By morning, the house stood empty. There was no formal announcement of the family's departure. When creditors arrived days later to inquire about mounting unpaid debts, they found the house abandoned, though apparently not in hasty clothes remained in wardrobes, books on shelves, and food in the pantry, as though the occupants expected to return shortly. Charles Delacroix, his wife Isabel, and their 3 children had vanished. Initial assumptions that they had fled creditors gave way to more sinister theories when, in March 1842, the bodies of 2 men were discovered in the swampland outside the city. They were identified as Delacroix's private secretary and his plantation manager from Boys Refuge. Both had been killed by a single gunshot to the head, execution style. A police investigation was launched, but yielded few results. The detective in charge, James Morrison, noted in his report that individuals connected to the case seemed remarkably reluctant to provide information, suggesting that forces beyond ordinary criminal matters might be involved. The investigation was officially suspended in June 1842. For more than a century, the disappearance of the Delacroix family remained one of New Orleans's most enduring mysteries. Occasionally revived in newspaper articles or local histories, but never resolved. Then, in 1962, the renovation of the long-vacant Delacroix mansion uncovered the hidden room containing Elellanena journal, the finger bones, and the portrait. The journal provided crucial insights into Elellanena captivity, but ended before her reappearance in 1842. The finger bones, when examined by forensic anthropologists in 1964, were determined to belong to a male who had died approximately 120 years earlier, roughly the time of the Delacroix disappearance. DNA testing, when it became available decades later, was inconclusive due to the condition of the remains. It was the portrait that perhaps offered the most tantalizing clue. The painting, executed in the style of prominent New Orleans portrait artists of the period, showed Elellanena Reynolds in an elegant blue gown, possibly the same one described at the Mardi Gras ball. But X-ray examination of the canvas in 1975 revealed another image underneath, a family portrait showing a man, a woman, and a young girl. Art historians identified the hidden subjects as John Baptiste Villers, his wife, and their infant daughter, based on comparison with other Villers family portraits from the period. The existence of this painting strongly supported the theory that Eleanor was indeed the legitimate daughter of John Baptiste Villers and thus potentially entitled to the Villers fortune. But why was this crucial evidence hidden in the Delacroix house rather than in Elellanena possession when she fled with Louis Villers? A partial answer emerged in 1982 when a collection of letters was discovered during the cataloging of the Villers family papers donated to the historic New Orleans collection. The letters exchanged between Louis Villers and an unnamed correspondent in Paris between 1841 and 1842 suggested a far more complex scenario than had previously been imagined. In one letter dated December 1841, Louis wrote that the arrangement was proceeding as planned. He had made contact with the subject and explained their mutual interest in resolving the matter quietly. She was understandably suspicious, but saw the logic in cooperation rather than continued conflict. D remained the primary obstacle, as his financial entanglements with the late uncle made him particularly resistant to any settlement that might expose their previous dealings. A subsequent letter from January 1842 stated that the documents had been verified by his attorney. There could be no doubt as to their authenticity or their legal implications. Had those papers come to light during the inheritance proceedings, the outcome would have been quite different. However, their present arrangement satisfied all parties. She gained her freedom and a suitable settlement, while the family avoided both scandal and financial restructuring. D alone remained unpacified, but his economic circumstances would eventually compel his cooperation. These cryptic communications suggested that Louis Villers had discovered proof of Elellanenna's legitimate claim to the Villers' inheritance, but had offered her a private settlement, likely including her freedom and financial compensation, in exchange for her silence and cooperation in keeping the matter from becoming public. This arrangement would have protected the Villers' family reputation while satisfying Elellanenna's most immediate desire for liberty. But Charles Delacroix, having paid an enormous sum for Eleanor, and perhaps being privy to financial irregularities in Henry Villers's dealings, was not included in this arrangement. The letters imply that he posed an ongoing threat to the resolution, perhaps through his knowledge of the situation or through legal claims he might make regarding Eleanor's status. The final letter in the collection, dated February 1842, shortly before the Delacroix family's disappearance, contained only a brief message. The problem had resolved itself in a most unexpected manner. No further action would be required. They sailed as planned on the 12th. What exactly transpired in those early February days of 1842? No definitive evidence has ever emerged, but historians and criminal investigators who have studied the case have constructed a plausible sequence of events. Upon seeing Eleanor at the Mardi Gras ball, Charles Delacroix realized that his valuable property had not only escaped, but had formed an alliance with Louis Villers. Desperate both financially and to maintain his social standing, Delacroix may have attempted blackmail, threatening to expose whatever arrangement had been made regarding the Villers' inheritance. Louis and Elellanena, preparing to depart for France, would have had strong motivation to ensure Delacroix's silence. The timing of their departure on February 12th and the Delacroix family's disappearance, just 15 days later, suggests a connection. The murdered secretary and plantation manager may have been eliminated as witnesses to whatever occurred at the Delacroix home. The finger bones found in the hidden room have never been positively identified, but their presence alongside Elellanenna's journal and the concealed portrait points to a violent conclusion to the Delacroix family's story. In 1968, French police records were discovered that shed a final piece of light on the mystery. A report dated May 1842 documented the arrival in Paris of Louis Villers and companion E. Reynolds, and noted that they had taken up residence in a fashionable district using funds from a substantial bank draft issued by the Villers family's New Orleans representatives. They apparently lived quietly in France for several years before relocating to England in 1847. English census records from 1851 list Louis and Eleanor Villers residing in London, with Eleanor described as wife rather than ward. They had 2 children by that time, The family remained in England until at least 1861, after which they disappear from public records. As for the Delacroix family, no trace of them was ever found. Their abandoned Royal Street house remained unoccupied for decades, acquiring a reputation as one of the most haunted properties in a city known for its ghostly residents. Local legend held that on certain nights, particularly during carnival season, the sounds of a struggle could be heard from within the empty house, followed by a woman's triumphant laughter. The case of Elellanena Reynolds represents a rare documented instance where the brutal economics of the slave system collided with the complex racial and inheritance laws of Louisiana, resulting in a chain of events that culminated in multiple disappearances and likely murders. It serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of a society built on racial categorization and human bondage, where a person's freedom, identity, and very life could depend on ancestry and appearance. The portrait of the Pearl now hangs in the historic New Orleans collection, a silent testament to a woman who refused to accept the fate that powerful men had designed for her. Her journal, with its eloquent account of captivity and resistance, has become an important primary source for historians studying the experiences of those trapped in the peculiar institution of American slavery. The final entry in the museum catalog describing Elellanena portrait contains a fitting epitaph. This painting depicts a woman who, through extraordinary circumstances, navigated one of the most rigid social systems in American history to reclaim her freedom and identity. What remains unknowable is the full human cost of her journey. In 1969, during further renovations of the Delacroix mansion, workers discovered a small cavity beneath the floorboards of the hidden room. Inside was a gold locket containing a miniature painting of a ship at sea. Engraved on the back were the initials JV and MR, presumably Jean Villers and Marie Reynolds, Elellanena mother, along with the date February 20, 1816, 9 months before Elellanena birth. The locket, like Elellanena herself, had traversed boundaries between worlds, between slavery and freedom, between black and white, between the known and the unknown. It now resides alongside her portrait in the museum collection, two artifacts from a story that continues to haunt the collective memory of a city built on secrets. The hidden room in the Delacroix house has since been preserved as part of the building's historical restoration. Tour guides tell visitors about the mysterious woman who was once sold at auction in the St. Louis Hotel, her connection to one of the city's most prominent families, and her eventual escape to Europe. What they cannot tell with certainty is what happened to those who sought to keep her enslaved. Like many of the darkest chapters in American history, some truths remain buried beneath layers of time, silence, and complicity. Perhaps that is fitting. In a city built on unstable ground, where the dead rest in above-ground tombs because the water table is too high for conventional burials, some secrets inevitably rise to the surface. Others remain submerged, known only through fragments and whispers, like the sound of distant laughter carried on the warm night air of the French Quarter. In 1958, nearly a decade before the discovery of Elellanena journal, a curious incident occurred that some historians believe may be connected to her story. An elderly woman named Margaret Wilson arrived in New Orleans, claiming to be the great-granddaughter of Elellanena Reynolds. She carried with her a stack of letters reportedly written by Elellanena from London between 1852 and 1868, addressed to a former house servant from the Villers estate who had remained loyal to her. The letters, if authentic, revealed that Elellanena and Louis had indeed married in France, where the racial restrictions that would have forbidden their union in Louisiana did not apply. They had lived comfortably on the settlement Louis, had arranged from the Villers estate, raising 3 children who were brought up with no knowledge of their mother's ordeal in America. Eleanor had apparently found a measure of peace in her new life, though she wrote of recurring nightmares about her time at Boys' Refuge and of a terrible necessity that had preceded her departure from New Orleans. Most significantly, one letter dated October 1867 made cryptic reference to the Delacroix family's fate. She wrote that she was still haunted by what Elle had felt compelled to arrange that February night, though she knew it was deemed necessary for their security. She could not reconcile herself to the thought of the children. Elle assured her they were sent away beforehand, but she had no way to verify this, and it troubled her conscience greatly. If they did indeed survive, they would be grown now, perhaps with children of their own, who knew nothing of their connection to her, or the events that scattered their family to the winds. Margaret Wilson submitted these letters to the Louisiana Historical Society for authentication, but died suddenly of a heart attack before the process could be completed. The letters disappeared from the Society's temporary holdings shortly thereafter, with the official report suggesting they had been mistakenly discarded during an office renovation. No family members came forward to claim Wilson's effects, and the trail went cold once again. Then, in 1976, a researcher named Thomas Lawrence, working on a comprehensive history of New Orleans slave markets, uncovered shipping records from March 1842 that documented 3 children traveling unaccompanied from New Orleans to Havana. The children's ages matched those of the Delacroix offspring, though they traveled under the surname Reynolds. Their guardian was listed as Martha Bernard, a name that appeared in Elellanenna's journal as the servant assigned to watch over her at Boys' Refuge plantation. This discovery lent credence to Elellanenna's suggestion in the purported Wilson letters that the Delacroix children had been spared whatever fate befell their parents. It also implied a level of planning and coordination that went beyond a simple act of revenge or elimination of threats. If Elellanena and Louise had arranged for the children's safe passage to Cuba before dealing with Charles and Isabel Delacroix, it suggested a complexity of moral reasoning that defied simple categorization. Cuban records showed no further trace of the children or their guardian after their arrival in Havana. Had they been absorbed into the local community, perhaps taken in by one of the many French-speaking immigrant populations? Or had they been sent farther afield, perhaps to Europe or South America, to ensure they could never return to claim their heritage or seek retribution? In the summer of 1981, during an unusually severe drought that caused the Mississippi River to reach record low levels, a local fisherman made a grim discovery in a normally submerged area near the former site of Boys' Refuge plantation. The receding waters had exposed the remnants of an old flatboat containing human remains: a man, a woman, and 2 adult males. Forensic examination determined that all 4 had died from gunshot wounds to the head, and that the bodies had been weighted down with iron chains before the boat was scuttled in deep water. The remains were too deteriorated for positive identification, but personal effects found with the bodies included a pocket watch engraved with the initials CD, and a woman's locket containing a miniature portrait of 3 children who bore a striking resemblance to descriptions of the young Delacroix heirs. The estimated time of death, based on the limited forensic techniques available, was consistent with the Delacroix family's disappearance in 1842. This discovery provided the most compelling evidence, yet for what many had long suspected: Charles and Isabel Delacroix, along with 2 male associates, likely the secretary and plantation manager, whose bodies had been found in the swamp shortly after the family's disappearance, had been executed and disposed of in the Mississippi River. The careful concealment suggested not a crime of passion, but a calculated elimination of witnesses and potential threats. What remained unclear was the extent of Elellanenna's involvement in this final brutal resolution. Had she been an active participant in planning retribution against those who had enslaved her, or had Louis Villers acted independently to remove obstacles to their future together? The execution-style killings pointed to experienced hands, possibly men in Louis Villers's employ, rather than the aristocratic heir himself. But the precision with which the Delacroix children had been separated from their parents before the killings suggested Elellanenna's influence, a last act of mercy from a woman who had herself been torn from her family. In 1994, the final piece of the puzzle emerged when an architectural historian researching the Villers family estate outside New Orleans discovered a sealed compartment within the master bedroom's fireplace mantel. Inside was a small leather pouch containing a handwritten confession signed by Louis Villers and dated February 25, 1842, 2 days before the Delacroix family's disappearance. The confession stated that what he had set in motion could not be undone, nor would he undo it if he could. The elimination of Charles and Isabelle Delacroix had become necessary not merely for his own interests, but for ease, safety, and freedom. Their claims against her would follow them even to Europe, and D's financial desperation made him unpredictable and dangerous. He had arranged for the children to be taken to Cuba, where Martha had contacts among the free, colored community who would ensure they were raised in comfort, though with no knowledge of their true parentage. He had insisted on this mercy, though he argued it created future risk. He could not deny her this, having witnessed the depth of her suffering at their hands. The men he had engaged for the task were reliable, and had been well compensated for both their service and their silence. They understood that any breach of confidence would result in their own elimination. The plan would be executed the next night, when the household was at rest. The bodies would never be found. He recorded this truth not out of remorse, but to ensure that should questions arise after their departure, there would exist at least one account of what truly occurred and why it was necessary. May God, if he exists, judge him as he sees fit. The confession was authenticated by handwriting experts as matching other examples of Louis Villers's script. Its discovery settled the question of responsibility for the Delacroix killings while raising new questions about the moral complexity of the case. Louis had acted as judge, jury, and executioner by proxy, ordering the deaths of 4 people to secure his and Elellanenna's future. Yet in the context of 1840s New Orleans, the legal system offered no justice or protection for Elellanena. She existed in a society that had commodified her, denied her humanity, and would have continued to enslave her despite her legitimate claim to freedom and even wealth. In 2002, DNA testing was performed on remains from a London cemetery where parish records indicated an Elellanena Villers, formerly of America, had been buried in 1872. The results were compared with genetic material recovered from the finger bones found in the hidden room of the Delacroix mansion. The tests confirmed a biological relationship, suggesting the finger bones likely belonged to Charles Delacroix, a gruesome trophy that had somehow been preserved in the secret room alongside Elellanenna's journal and the concealed family portrait. Elellanena Reynolds Villers died at the age of 55, having lived more than half her life as a free woman in Europe. According to London church records, her funeral was well attended by family and numerous friends, suggesting she had found community and perhaps even happiness in her adopted country. Louis Villers outlived her by 6 years, dying in 1878. Their 3 children married into respectable English families. their mother's racial background and extraordinary history, apparently unknown to their spouses or social circles. As for the Delacroix children, despite extensive research by historians and descendants of both the Villers and Delacroix families, no definitive trace of them has ever been found in Cuban records or elsewhere. They vanished into history, casualties of a system that had valued human beings as property and bloodlines as determinants of worth. Their disappearance represents yet another cost of America's peculiar institution: the orphaning of children whose parents had participated in and benefited from a moral atrocity. The story of Elellanena Reynolds stands as testament to the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit in the face of institutionalized cruelty. Born to a free woman of color and the disinherited son of a wealthy plantation owner, she navigated the treacherous waters of racial classification, enslavement, and ultimately violent liberation. Her journey from auction block to London drawing rooms encompassed the full spectrum of experiences possible for a woman of mixed racial heritage in the 19th century. Today, visitors to the historic New Orleans collection can view Elellanina's portrait, the hidden family painting beneath it, and the gold locket that linked her to her true parentage. These artifacts, along with her journal, constitute one of the most complete records of the inner life of a woman caught in the machinery of American slavery. But they tell only part of the story. The rest exists in silences, in the absence of the Delacroix family from subsequent history, in the unknown fate of their children, in the gaps between journal entries, and in the moral ambiguities inherent in acts of violence committed in the name of justice when no legal justice was available. In recent years, descendants of the Villers family have established a scholarship fund for African American students studying law, named in Elellanena Reynolds' honor. The fund's creation was accompanied by a formal acknowledgement of Elellenena's place in the family lineage and an apology for the actions of Henry Villers in denying her father's marriage and her rightful heritage. It represents a small step toward reconciliation with a history that continues to shape American society and its institutions. The former Delacroix mansion on Royal Street, after changing hands multiple times, now operates as a small historic hotel. Guests occasionally report unusual phenomena: the sound of a woman's footsteps in the night, items moved from where they were left, and most commonly a feeling of being watched in the vicinity of the hidden room, which has been preserved as a historical feature of the building. Whether these are manifestations of restless spirits or simply the power of suggestion in a city steeped in stories of the supernatural remains a matter of individual belief. What is certain is that the walls of that house absorbed the suffering of a woman who refused to accept the identity forced upon her, who fought, survived, and ultimately transcended the boundaries erected to contain her. Elellenena's journal ends with her plans for escape, but her story continued long after those final written words. She transformed herself from property to person, from captive to free woman, from victim to perhaps even avenger. In doing so, she embodied the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American slavery: the persistent, undeniable humanity of those whom the system attempted to reduce to mere commodities. In the end, the bizarre mystery of the pearl is not merely a tale of auction blocks and hidden rooms, of forged documents and midnight escapes, of love across racial boundaries, or even of murder concealed by flowing waters. It is the story of a woman who insisted on writing her own narrative in a time and place determined to write it for her. That she succeeded, even at terrible cost, stands as both inspiration and indictment, a complex legacy that continues to resonate in a nation still grappling with the long shadow of its founding sin. As night falls over the French Quarter and gas lamps cast their flickering glow across cobblestone streets, tour guides still point out the Delacroix house to visitors eager for tales of ghosts and scandal. Few among them recognize that they walk daily over ground where human beings were once bought and sold, or that beneath the Mississippi's muddy surface may lie the bones of those who participated in that commerce. The river keeps its secrets, as does the city built precariously beside it. But occasionally, when conditions are just right, when waters recede or walls are opened or long sealed documents come to light, the truth emerges, demanding acknowledgement. In those moments, we glimpse not just the specific horrors endured by Elellanena Reynolds and inflicted by Charles Delacroix, but the larger horror of a society built on such relationships. Perhaps that is why Elellanina's portrait continues to draw visitors who stand before it in lengthy contemplation. In her amber eyes, expertly rendered by an unnamed artist, one can see both suffering and determination, vulnerability and strength. She gazes not at the viewer but slightly past, toward something or someone beyond our field of vision. What she sees there, judgment, redemption, or simply the next chapter in her extraordinary life, remains as mysterious as the woman herself. In 2019, a team of forensic scientists and historians used advanced imaging technology to examine the hidden portrait beneath Elellanina's painting in unprecedented detail. The results confirmed what had long been suspected. The family portrayed was indeed John Baptiste Villers, his wife Marie Reynolds, and their infant daughter. More surprisingly, spectral analysis of the paint revealed that Eleanor herself had likely been the artist who painted over the original portrait, using similar pigments and techniques to create her own image on top of that of her family. The act represented both concealment and reclamation, a palimpsest of identity that mirrored her own complex journey. And so the story ends where it began, with an image of a woman whose extraordinary beauty belied an even more extraordinary spirit. The mystery of the pearl may never be fully resolved, but in its outline, sketched from journals and letters, ship manifests and court records, confessions and DNA results, we see reflected the larger American mystery of race, identity, and the human capacity to both inflict and overcome injustice. As you leave this account of Elellanena Reynolds' life, consider that the ground beneath your feet holds countless similar stories, never recorded, never discovered, never told. For every Elellanena who managed to leave behind a journal and portrait, thousands of others disappeared into history without trace. Their struggles and triumphs known only to a God who, one hopes, kept better records than human institutions. Their collective silence echoes still on warm southern nights, when the air hangs heavy with jasmine and the distant sound of river boats. In a city where beauty and cruelty have always existed in uncomfortable proximity, listen closely, and you might hear them, the voices of those who, like Elellanena, refuse to be merely what others declared them to be. Their whispers remind us that the past is never truly past, that justice delayed is often justice denied, and that the human spirit, once awakened to its own worth, cannot be contained by any system, no matter how entrenched or powerful. In the words written on the back of Elellanina's portrait when it was donated to the historic New Orleans collection in 1974, remember her not for her beauty, which was remarkable, nor for her suffering, which was immense, but for her determination to exist on her own terms in a world that offered her no place. In this she achieved what few of any race or station can claim. She wrote herself into being.